Good morning, YouTube. Welcome to the Dovetails and Dados Woodshop. Today on Get Kids Woodworking episode 13, I am going to show you guys how to make a simple napkin holder. The first thing I'm going to do is I didn't have a scrap that was wide enough to do what I wanted. So I have some maple and a couple little pieces of oak, and I am going to glue them together to make a little base. I believe the final dimensions will end up being 7 1/4 by 8 3/8, I think is what I'm going to make it. Pretty simple here. You just run a bead of glue down it, smear it around, and slide it up next to that piece. You do the same on this one. Haha, I can just use that napkin. Once that's done, we're just going to put a clamp on it. One clamp in the middle should do. It doesn't have to be extremely tight. There's not a lot of force there. And that should do it. I'm going to hang this over the edge just a little bit so I can use my clamp as a caul. And we'll let that sit up, glue up for about 30 minutes or so. Alright guys, it's been 30 minutes, 45 minutes, and I believe this is glued up well enough that we can go ahead and proceed. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cut it and another piece that you'll need to 8 3/8. To do that today, I am going to use my crosscut sled on my table saw. So I will spin the camera around. Lower it down just a little and make the cuts. Notice I've included a stopwatch so that I can make sure my distances are where I want them. Alright, now that we have that cut to size, we're ready to move on to the next step. Alright, I'm ready to sand this base down. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to sand it with 80 grit paper, and then I'll do 150 and 220. After that, we'll have to drill a couple holes, glue some dowel rod in place, and then we'll be ready to move on. I sanded with 80 and 150, and then I decided to take a break and talk about, you could, if you have a router, you could router a profile onto the edges or do something like that. For simplicity's sake, I am just going to take my hand plane and just kind of lightly chamfer the edges. I just kind of want to knock the corner off of it. going to cut just a little deeper. And I will do that to all 4 edges. Alright guys, here's a little note about hand planing, using the hand plane and chamfering the edges. You always want to do your long grain first. As you can tell, I'm doing the long edges first. That lessens the likelihood of blowing out the corner when you turn it around to do the end grain. If you just go straight to the end grain, it's pretty likely that your plane blade will catch and tear out on the corner. Even if you're doing it with the long grain first, there's a chance of it, but it's a lot less likely. It's not bad usually. Sometimes it's a pain to sand out, but I like to do the long grain first just to be safe. Once you're done with the chamfering of the edges, you can go ahead and use your 220 grit paper. And I just like to smooth over the edges, round the corners a little bit, just to make sure there's nothing sharp. The 220 grit paper is what I'm going to do the final sanding on for the base and the rest of the project. So yeah, just hit it with a little 220, keep everything smooth and nice to the touch. Alright, now that we have the base glued up, the cork feet glued on, and we're ready to move to the next step, we need to drill some holes. This project, I'm going to drill 2 different sized holes. The holes in the base will be 5/16 of an inch. And the first thing we need to do is find the center of our board. Which is right there. So I'm going to take my junk chisel and make a little mark. Just the slightest little mark. I don't even know that I can see it, let alone you guys. There we go. Now I can see it. And then I want to come in 1/2 of an inch. I got this square already set. And we'll just put a mark there. That is where our hole will be. Do the same thing on the other side. Okay. And once you have those marked, you can go ahead and drill your 5/16 inch hole. Now, the way this is going to work is we're going to have some dowels sticking up out of the base. It's important here to keep your drill at 90 degrees. I don't know about you guys, but sometimes I have trouble keeping my drill at 90 degrees. So I like to just take a couple blocks to use as guides. And that should help keep everything at 90 degrees. Now, you can go all the way through or you can do a little stop. Either way, not really a big deal either way. So we'll do the same thing over here. Flip this board around. One thing I will say is you want to get your drill bit, the point of your drill bit, on your mark before you slide your blocks into place. going to go just a little deeper on this side. Okay, and I did not go all the way through. I just drilled down 1/4 of an inch or so. Then we need to cut our dowel. This is really up to you. You can make it as tall as you want. I'm probably going to leave mine pretty short at like 3 inches or so, just because we rarely have a big stack of napkins to put in there. So I'm going to cut mine at 3 inches, maybe 3.5. I'm going to go 3.5. Chisels double as a marking gauge in case you didn't know. Almost through. And right about here is where the furnace kicked on in the basement and you couldn't hear a thing. So anyways, I'm going to go ahead and glue this dowel in place. Just need to cut 2 little pieces to the same length and then put them down in the hole with a little glue. And that should be more than sufficient to hold them in place. They're not going to have a lot of pressure on them, and that should be good. If you go all the way through, you'll have to trim them off on the back side. Alright guys, here's a little tip. When you're gluing these dowels in place, go ahead and take your tri-square apart or your combo square apart, and you can get down here and eyeball it, and you probably have just a little bit of wiggle room to make sure these little pegs are good and square. Especially if you don't drill all the way through. If you just drill in 1/4 of an inch or so, you should be able to see if they're square, everything looks good. The next step is going to be this piece here. This one is about 1 1/4 inches wide. They're both 1/2 inch thick and the same length. So this we need to drill a couple holes in, and we'll set it right on top of that. Now these holes are going to be slightly bigger. Since these dowels are 5/16 of an inch, we want to go 3/8 of an inch on these holes. Same thing as we did on the base though. You just want to find the center and go 1/2 inch in. That way it lines up good and the ends will be even. As you can tell, they're the same length. So come in 1/2 of an inch. Here's another little trick. Get you a little compass. They work great for this kind of stuff. Set that at 1/2 inch, and then you can just come in 1/2 inch, make a mark. As long as your pencil doesn't move. It's still 1/2 of an inch. As you can tell, I got my marks there. So then we just need to make sure we're in the center. That was pretty close for eyeballing it. That one's pretty much spot on. Oops. That's alright, we're going to be drilling a hole there. Alright. Go ahead and clamp that down. And drill our hole. Now, since these holes are bigger, you don't have to be quite as particular about being at 90 degrees. Clamp this one down a little better. Unclamp it, and that should sit right down on there, and that will hold your napkins down. When the weather's nice and it's not the middle of December, we like to eat out on the patio, and I remember my grandparents had a napkin holder similar to this that they would take camping with us, and it was always nice because it had just enough weight on it to not let the napkins go blowing away. The last little step is to sand off your dowels a little bit. And then I'm going to put a coat of finish on it. I'm just going to use a wipe-on poly. Everything's sanded to 220, and it should be a finished project. Hope you've enjoyed it. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the comment section below, and we'll see you next time.